Nadat mijn hoogbegaafde zoon met schooltrauma was uitgevallen op het basisonderwijs en hierdoor een van de duizenden thuiszitters werd die Nederland rijk is, verslond ik alles wat ik over hoogbegaafdheid kon vinden. Want hoewel hoogbegaafdheid heel veel mooie kanten kent, kunnen onze kinderen het toch soms knap lastig hebben. Uiteindelijk besloten wij als gezin dat wij de kennis en ervaringen die wij hadden opgedaan wilden delen met andere ouders en leerkrachten, zodat de reis voor hen iets makkelijker zou worden. We doen dit via het boek Een Intense Reis, maar ook via deze podcast, waarin deskundigen op het gebied van begaafdheid hun kennis delen, want samen komen we verder. Dit is Een Intense Reis, de podcast, en mijn naam is Marije Hofland. Hi everyone, today's episode will be in English again because I have a very special guest all the way from Switzerland. Because Jennifer is situated in Switzerland, we have recorded this conversation via a Zoom call, and I used a different microphone, and especially during the first few minutes of the conversation, this took some getting used to. Therefore, the sound is not perfect, but I feel it gets better as the podcast progresses, and the valuable content Jennifer shares makes listening to this podcast, at least in my eyes, very much worthwhile. My guest today is Jennifer Harvey Sallin. Jennifer is a psychologist and the founding director at InterGifted. InterGifted started as a social experiment in 2015, inviting gifted adults together all around the world in an online community and via gifted-specific coaching, mentoring and workshops. Jennifer and her colleagues have built a collaborative network of coaches who are themselves gifted or twice exceptional and who are trained specifically to support gifted adults in their gifted integration, as well as personal, professional and social development via online sessions. They offer online courses, groups and professional training opportunities for gifted adults. And also they offer mentoring for gifted therapists, coaches and other helping professionals and developing leaders. Welcome, Jennifer. I'm so glad that we can have this conversation today.
Yes, thank you so much for welcoming me and inviting me to have this important conversation.
Yeah, we were already talking about, before we started the record button, we were already talking about how I came across today's subject, and that I already spoke about this subject in previous episodes of my podcast, because today's podcast is going to be about gifted trauma. And there are some moments in life where you just remember where you were and what time of the day it was when you came across something, when something happened that is really important to you. And for me, basically, one of those moments was when I was listening to your podcast on gifted trauma, when I was going through my own search, what it meant to be gifted, basically what it meant to me. And one of the things that I was asking myself every time was, what of the things that I am experiencing basically is related to me being gifted? And what is related to the way my life has been, the trauma that I'm experiencing, the intense way in which I experience the world. I just wanted to know, whether it had something to do with my giftedness or whether it had something to do with trauma. And I was just searching for answers because when I was looking for answers in the field of trauma and reading books about trauma, they would never take into account this being gifted. So I just couldn't relate to the way that they were describing, the whole process of trauma, because I thought, no, to me it feels different. But the same would apply for, the literature on giftedness. I was like, but I can relate to the way that they describe, the intense way you experience the world and stuff, but I still felt there was something missing, and it was like, related to the trauma I had experienced in my life. So searching for answers, I also went to Spotify and I typed in gifted and trauma. And that's when your podcast came up. And I remember listening to the first episodes, already feeling, lonely, like an alien, like there was no one in the world like me. And I was just crying. And it finally felt like you and Corinne, that you were recording the podcast with, you were going through the same thing, and there finally were some answers. So thank you for that. That was really important in my process. But for the people who don't know what this term gifted trauma is, could you tell the listeners a little bit more about it?
Yeah. Well, your experience of finding the podcast and crying a lot and feeling seen for the first time, I think, is something we've heard so much over the years. And it's not funny, haha, but it's a bit funny to think that when we put out the first episode, it was just, we said so on the episode, it was an experimental conversation to see where we go. We just knew somebody needed to talk about this intersection between giftedness and trauma. And I remember naming it, like our podcast is on Anchor FM. And so it's like anchor.fm/gifted-trauma. And I was thinking, who on earth is going to search for this?
Well, that's me.
Nobody's going to think of it. And now we have, I don't know, I'm not good with all of these things about how many people listen and stuff, like metrics and stuff. I don't really care. But every once in a while, I'll see some number that jumps out at me from the website. And it's a lot. I think that more than 50,000 people have, listened to the podcast. So I think a lot of people are really touched by it in important ways. But a person wouldn't necessarily think to put these two things together. I think a lot of that comes from the fact that trauma in the past was not really well known. I mean, trauma before the work of Bessel van der Kolk was basically this idea that, war veterans had PTSD and that was trauma, and the rest was just life. I mean, even me, I remember training as a psychologist. I left my training as a psychologist thinking, well, I had a dysfunctional family or a dysfunctional childhood, but I never called it traumatic. It was only later that I started to realize, oh my God, I went through some pretty serious trauma. I think one of the first ways I learned about it myself was through learning about religious trauma. And that's the way that I had gone through it, came to it. So just to say, I think it hasn't, this idea of trauma, and now we'll talk about it a little bit later, but developmental trauma, microtrauma, trauma, I think all of these things weren't really talked about before. There was this idea that it was war related, and then eventually it became kind of like, oh no, also like natural disasters, life-threatening things,
like sexual abuse, child abuse. You read about that.
Yeah, these things. Okay, we all agree that those things are traumatic, but so it went through that for a little bit, and then people were saying, the nervous system's kind of doing the same thing in these small traumas. It might not be getting a total life shock, like a holistic overall shock, but it is getting a shock nonetheless. And it is developing these patterns of constriction, then fight, flight, freeze, and fawn came about, and work started to be done around developmental trauma. And so it's like bit by bit, we're getting smarter, thankfully, collectively about this. And it's due to, the important work of a lot of people out there. Van der Kolk was one. Pete Walker has been really great for CPTSD.
Absolutely.
Informing people about CPTSD. There's so many great researchers out there doing work in this field now. So then, because this work is being done and we are getting a finer understanding of what is really considered traumatic and what our nervous system is really doing in response to, the daily dysfunctions or the daily pains that we experience, then it starts to make sense that, okay, maybe my life was never outrightly threatened because I'm gifted. However, I was bullied, or however I was told constantly that I was too much, or however I never found a person in my life that shared a similar worldview or values as me. And over time, those things, become quite overwhelming, traumatic, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the things that stopped a lot of people even entertaining this idea that they could have gifted trauma is that they feel terribly privileged or guilty to say such a thing.
To even call it trauma.
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea of gifted trauma sounds like oxymoronic. Like, how could that be? Because if it's a gift, it's not traumatic.
Yeah.
But, it either helps you to fit into your world and find belonging and self-esteem and all of the things that make life worth living and meaningful, or it doesn't help you. And that's not because it's good or bad. It's just because it either fits or doesn't fit, or, it has some combination of fitting and not fitting. And the not fitting part is where it can become traumatic.
Yeah. One of the questions I was also, asking myself when I was reading, for example, about overexcitabilities and the way that I was experiencing the world, could it also be that because our nervous system is, functioning different than the nervous system of other people, it's more sensitive, that things that, regular society doesn't necessarily view as, being traumatic or necessarily experience as being traumatic can be, more traumatic for gifted people because, the stimuli, they just enter, your being. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A gifted person doesn't necessarily have overexcitabilities, but those of us who do definitely stand a stronger chance at having some kind of trauma in the area of the overexcitability. So I've had so many experiences myself and talked to so many people over the years who, let's say, have emotional overexcitability, as I do, and they will be with other gifted people, and they'll all be experiencing the same thing, and their nervous system is getting totally out, unregulated, and they are not able to handle whatever's going on. They're feeling scared or freezing, or having even maybe a severe trauma reaction, and the other people around are just like, the other gifted people around are just saying, okay, that's life, no big deal, whatever. And that can feel very strange as well. That can feel like, wait, I'm supposed to be like them, but now I'm like totally different, and I'm freaking out and they're not. So, oh my God, is this another level of weird or alien, or however
exactly.
you feel?
I'm just a totally different level of alien.
Yeah. And that gets compounded with actual traumas, that like developmental traumas, for example, that we've experienced. So I've seen that people who have experienced developmental trauma on the emotional level, and if they have emotional overexcitability, those two can get really combined together, really twisted up together, where that intensity of the overexcitability becomes really almost torturous a lot of the time. Because overexcitability shouldn't really be torturous. It should be neutral to pleasant. Sometimes it's a little overkill. Sometimes you want it to,
but in
combination
with trauma, it's it can feel like torture.
It really can. Yeah.
Is there any way that you can tell the difference between what is actually part of your like your authentic self, like your genuine personality as a gifted person, and the parts that is like even more intensified because it's trauma related? I was struggling because I was identified as a highly gifted person, so not a profoundly gifted person. But every time I would like read about giftedness, I would recognize myself more in the way that profoundly gifted people experience the world, their level of intensity. And I was just, basically struggling because I didn't want to, I didn't feel justified, relating to, being profoundly gifted because, I felt like that's, that wasn't me. But on the other hand, it did match the way I was experiencing life better than, quote unquote, just being highly gifted. So I think that that's also where part of my initial question came from, like, what parts is like gifted related and what part is like my, and thus my authentic self, and which part is like more trauma related, and could like being gifted and trauma like be this little, almost like a little imposter, which seems like, for example, a profoundly gifted person experiencing the world. And that's why you can relate. That was something that I was struggling with as well.
I think I could imagine a person that's gifted having trauma that makes them feel like they don't fit within their level of giftedness. That's something I can imagine.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine the trauma actually making them more highly gifted than they are naturally. What I can imagine is that and I've seen it's that trauma can open up spaces in a person's life that they were forced to go. So one of the big ways that this shows up that I've seen is especially for women, like all of the emotional labor that is expected and all of the ways that it's expected we be of service.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's a lot that we've developed in our personalities to function without, getting violence against us, whether that's like emotional or physical or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm saying women specifically. I know this happens to all genders, but it's something we see a lot, especially those of us who grew up a while ago. Hopefully things are changing, but I know when I was growing up, it was really much like, it was really like that. So, we can have this kind of part of ourselves that trauma forced us into knowing that we may never have explored otherwise. So we may, connect to other gifted people at our same giftedness level who don't have those traumas. And we may be like, wait, but I have this whole other, sometimes we joke about it, wing of the universe that's available to me.
Yeah.
And what I usually find in working with people is that it's difficult for them to want to give up that wing of the universe, because it's almost like once you see it and know it, you feel like you can't close the door to it. And that can be really difficult and damaging. I don't want to use like too big of words and too dramatic, but it can be very damaging because there are parts of us, most people are caring people to some degree. So it's not like by giving up that whole wing of the universe, you give up being a caring person or you give up your capacity to have empathy. But it's that next level, like the trauma reactions, like the extreme fawning, the extreme people pleasing, the extreme self-denial and self-effacing, behaviors, imposter syndrome, anytime you show any sort of level of competition with anybody, or anytime that you show any sort of superiority to anybody, this, all of these behaviors that can become really, over the top and ultimately damaging to the self. It can be hard to give those things up. But to come back to the authentic self, we generally do have to agree to sort of give some of those things up. And so people can say, yeah, but it makes me feel like I'm reducing myself. And the reality is, if you were forced outside of yourself, then yeah, you should. I mean, the healthy thing is to reduce. Like if you're, I don't know, from a trauma state, you're working 20 hours a day and sleeping only 4. Yeah, it's better that you reduce those working hours, because that's not healthy for any of us. Something like it takes this big shift for people to go, okay, my life opened up this big intensity for me, but I have to I have to get used to living with less intensity.
How do you do that?
Yeah, right. Well, it's a really difficult process, and it's a lot of what we do in our assessments, where we're really looking at where is the like innate overexcitability, like like I said, the neutral to positive
Exactly.
overexcitability. What is that intensity in you, and how can you cultivate that and channel it in a good way, in a way that serves your higher purpose and serves your unique soul's purpose, whatever, however we want to say it, and that nourishes you, without letting it go into trauma land. And that's what that's where it becomes this kind of very detailed work where you're doing almost like you're going in, at the granular level and going, okay, how do I get this really clear understanding of which is which? Because it's really hard to know. And that's especially true for, like I said, those of us who have, let's say, in my example before, as women who have a lot of empathy and do love to care for people. And one of the ways that we show our gifts is caring for people. Then it becomes difficult to discern, am I doing this because I was taught to people please? And there's this intensity in people pleasing, or am I doing this because of the intensity of love that I feel naturally, just from my, from my inner being? And I will bring in the word complexity too, because you can use the gifted complexity, or let's say the gifted complexity can be used for the natural authentic expression, or it can be used for the trauma expression. And so just in the same way that we were talking about before, where the overexcitability can be paired, intertwined with trauma, the giftedness itself can also be intertwined with the trauma. So in those cases, it's less about the intensity, but more about the complexity. So that's when like my traumatic people pleasing becomes very complex. Like I develop a very complex system of people pleasing and caring for other people while I'm totally ignoring my own needs, while I'm shaming myself, while I'm thinking hateful thoughts toward myself inside, this kind of behavior. So yeah, it can show up in all of these different combinations, and then it's for us to go look into it. But we can't. I mean, it's hard to do alone.
Yeah, I know.
It's easy to talk about it like that, like as a process. Yeah, you just do this and that, but it's not just this and that, because you get triggered at every point, right? Because the responses that we have to trauma were to protect us. So
absolutely,
there's a purpose, and they are scary to give up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially when there is there is developmental trauma going on. If the gifted trauma is like we were talking about before, caused by not fitting in, feeling different, feeling alien, being in an environment that doesn't meet your needs. If that happens for a long time, I feel like this could also, give you a feeling of like toxic stress. And you're always on high alert, and, it's prohibiting you from basically being your authentic self. And in literature, they didn't talk about like gifted trauma per se, but they were talking about similar situations when people are experiencing toxic stress, which is due to being in an environment that is basically doesn't match their needs. And they were calling it microtrauma. And it's hard for people to understand how like just not fitting in, because sometimes you're going along. I mean, you have people around you, you have friends, but you don't really experience any like true connection. So you are experiencing a type of stress. You're feeling different, so your body just experiences it as trauma. For people who don't understand this type of trauma, could you please share a little bit more about how like microtrauma, trauma that is not necessarily perceived as something that can actually be traumatic, can actually impact someone's life, and to which degree can it impact someone's life? Is it similar to like developmental trauma, or is it something different?
Yeah, these are really important distinctions to be made, and they're very confusing for most people, even practitioners in the field, because they all kind of overlap, and it kind of depends on which context you're talking about. And was it emotional trauma? Was it from parents? Was it at school? That all kind of changes how it gets labeled.
Exactly. And sometimes they don't even understand because, for example, was it at school? You're saying, just simply going to school and not fitting in or not getting your needs met, for people who haven't experienced this, it is really hard to understand that can be traumatic. They can understand it can be a burden.
Yeah.
But not that it can actually traumatize you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, when I think about trauma, when I teach about trauma, I'm always saying the thing to understand is that it changes the patterns of your thinking, it changes the patterns of belief, and then it changes the patterns of your body. So if you have anything that kind of chronically puts you into reduced mobility state, and reduced flexibility, so that's mental flexibility, emotional flexibility, physical capacity to move around, and so on, and also relational flexibility. Then you start to wonder, okay, what's going on here that I'm starting to develop these chronic behaviors toward fighting, toward fleeing,
exactly,
fawning, and the typical trauma responses.
Yeah.
So it kind of doesn't matter if it's a big thing or a small thing. If your body's reacting that way, it means that it doesn't feel safe and it's trying to protect you. I always just tell people, because people will say to me, yeah, but I had parents that loved me, and I know my teachers tried hard, and I had enough money. Like, I don't have anything to complain about. And I'm like, it's not about complaining. It's about recognizing what your nervous system felt, how you felt. And there's no one that's better than another. There's no one trauma that's like the trauma, and then the rest is all complaining. It's just what your body did. And so it's the same, for me, it's the same as when we look at a giftedness profile. Like, there's no one better giftedness profile. Higher isn't better, more isn't better. It's just different, and you need to understand what yours is so that you can live your life authentically from that. And the same thing is true with trauma. Like, we all have something. I mean, maybe not some serious big T traumas, but we've all been bullied a few times. We've all been neglected in certain ways, whether that was just emotional neglect, or I'm quoting just, and not physical neglect. Maybe we got good food, but we didn't get emotional, or sometimes it's sensual, like we didn't get soothing touch. And so we think, yeah, but my parents love me and they tried their best. Yeah, but your nervous system was freaking out or shutting down or whatever. And so you just can't turn away from that. Yeah. And again, a lot of times people want to reject that because they say, yeah, but I mean, in terms of the giftedness question, because they want to say, yeah, but that's like, rich people's problems or first world problems. And I'm like, but your nervous system doesn't care about that.
Exactly.
It doesn't have this narrative about, the relativity of problems. It felt its own problems. It felt its own need to protect itself.
Yeah.
So I almost think it's doing an extra harm to yourself to say, yeah, well, my problems don't really count. Obviously, you don't want to blow them up either and say, I'm a victim for the rest of my life because I got bullied sometimes. No, that's not true either. But saying that you shouldn't complain and you shouldn't think about it, that's not helpful either.
Yeah. But one of the things that I was also thinking when you were talking about this microtrauma is, and you were also talking about that in your podcast, is that there's also a lot of shame involved. Like, who am I to experience this as being traumatic? Because I'm given all these opportunities, I'm in school, I have people who care about me, I have friends, and still, I feel different. And I'm even putting the word trauma to it. That's, for me, was well, basically, in a way, it was traumatic in itself, because I just didn't feel justified, so I was like trying to ignore my own feelings, but still, I mean, they were there, even if it didn't really matter if I was ignoring it or not. Yeah, it was there. I was lonely. I was like feeling different. I was like showing people pleasing behavior because I wanted people to like me, and I was just adjusting myself to basically fit in. And that was traumatizing, not to just be my genuine self.
Yeah.
Yeah. You were also talking about that in your podcast. Is that also something that you hear a lot, that people, they just basically feel guilty about the way they feel?
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of it has to do with culture, because the further I get out of America, the more people feel guilty for using the word, and they feel like they don't have the right to say that. So there's a lot of psychoeducation about the issue that has to happen, from us and whoever else is willing to talk about it. Because again, your body has done what it's done in response to what it felt. And if it's in these protection mechanisms, not naming it isn't really
it doesn't make
a
it
strategy for resolving
absolutely
where you're stuck, or where the intensity is too much. So that said, it's probably not the best idea to go like hit the bug with a hammer. Like you can you don't have to do that either. So it's not, I don't advise people to just push through it, because then, like you said, then it can become another trauma. Like, okay, I gotta force myself to identify with this word and stuff. The idea is that the words point to something, just like with giftedness, it points to something, but it's not, the word isn't the end in itself. I mean, it represents a kind of symbolism that we lay on our experience. And so same with people rejecting the word gifted and saying, I'll never identify with that. I would feel so ashamed to identify, like I would feel so elitist or ableist or something. I'm like, okay, well, are there other words you could put to your experience that feel less, overwhelming or scary or potentially traumatic or something? And then the same thing with trauma, people can ease into it.
Absolutely.
Slowly.
Yeah. In one of the last episodes of my podcast, I was talking to Janne van der Ven about, the coaching she did for gifted people. And that was related to this. Like, people had to find out what it actually meant to them, because, they were reading all about, being gifted. But some of the things they would recognize and some of the things they wouldn't recognize. So they had to basically have their own journey of this, discovering what it was that, being gifted actually meant to them. And then during that phase, it will basically feel like there would be nothing else in the world. It's just something that they would talk about every day, think about it multiple times a day. Like, every book they would read will be about giftedness. So basically, it would feel like there was nothing else that exists, just that, and that soul searching journey that you're on at the time. And she said, it's good if you just make it bigger to see, you know, what it means to you. And then there's a phase where you can normalize, you know, being gifted. And then you can see, you know, how can I start using this as a strength and be my authentic self, and basically use it to be the person that I want to be and can be in the world. Would the same apply for like gifted trauma? Is there like the people who come to you and you coach them because they have listened to your podcast, for example, or read your articles, and they can relate to the term of gifted trauma, and that is something that they want to work on, is their self-esteem. What would such a process look like for them if you from a high over point of view? I mean, obviously each process is different for each person, but are there also like certain stages that you see, you know, people go through like every time?
Yeah, it depends on where their starting point is. So if they're already, for example, comfortable with the idea of trauma, and then they just understand that there's gifted trauma, then they maybe have already done some work on healing trauma, and then they kind of ease into it. But for somebody like how we were talking before, for somebody who is absolutely ashamed at the thought of identifying with trauma in general, and then on top of that gifted trauma, then we have to start like super, super slow. And personally, I wouldn't even recommend that it's done in coaching. I would recommend that that's done in therapy. Yeah, because it really needs that safe container. I mean, not to say that coaching isn't safe, but it's a totally different format.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So, yeah. So the idea is just working with the shame first, without even kind of talking about the trauma exactly, even though, I mean, it's a loop, right? It's a feedback loop. Like if you mention the word trauma, then the shame comes up. And then if you feel the shame, then it's another trauma. And, you know, so, but just kind of working with that, you know, kind of titrating between the idea of acknowledging one's experience and then feeling the shame of that, and then comforting that self, you know, the shame self, and then kind of coming back and seeing, now that I've gotten the comfort and the mirroring and the acknowledgement in a safe space, then can I come back to that idea and look at it again? So that usually takes some time. Then once somebody is comfortable with saying the word trauma, right, then it comes that kind of identification phase where it's like, oh, now that I am allowed to admit it, yeah, I did feel extremely lonely, or yeah, I did get bullied a lot, or I did feel like I was too much, or yeah, like everybody loved me, but nobody saw my gifts and nobody ever mentioned anything about them. So like, not that anybody was aggressive toward me, but more like the neglect side, you know? Or like people did see my gifts and they totally exploited them for their own purposes. You know, there's kind of these three things that I really look at with people, or that I recommend that they look at in therapy, which is like the negative, you know, the lacking things, the things that were just, they were there, but they were a mismatch. And then the things that were like exploitation and like actual abuse, you know, neglect. It can be a kind of abuse, but, you know, kind of active abuse, if we want to, aggressive abuse, or sort of on the offense abuse.
It actually almost sounds like there's this part of inner child work that goes before. Yeah, to
a degree. And it's like working with the adult to say, can we provide a safe place for that child to kind of do a different way forward? Because it's always scary, whether it's gifted specific trauma or not. It is always scary to you know, allow the personality to redevelop itself in a different format, because we might feel pain, but we feel safe in the shape that we've constructed, you know, through the trauma. So changing that shape is really tough, and it does take a lot of being with the younger selves that did construct that for us, and saying, you know, I thank you for doing it for me. And like now
Yeah.
we get a chance to grow up. And a lot of what that points to is this fragmentation that happens when we go through trauma.
Yeah. And also realizing that the things that you went through as a child, because you didn't fit in, like even in school, I think it's more difficult because you can't choose your own path. You have to go to school. So yeah, basically later on in life, when you're an adult, you have more opportunities to create your own environment. So you can, pick your own line of work. You can, to a degree, choose the people you work with. Do I start my own business? Which courses do I take? Like things like that. Even your own time. Like what do you invest in yourself, your own private time? And as a child, you don't have that opportunity. So there's a lot of like damage that is still attached to that, and you still feel in your body, like Bessel says, your body keeps the score of like what happens in childhood. But later on, when you realize that you're not in the same situation anymore, you now have more opportunities to create your own life and create your own self than you did growing up. Realizing that, and basically giving the child inside you that safe environment, and just realizing, oh, it's okay. And now I have the power myself to grow and to choose how I deal with things, and to work on things, and to shape the world that it's in line with my own values and my own beliefs. Realizing that and going through that process, like not just from an adult point of view, but also going back, like in a way, like hugging your the child that you once were. Like, it's okay, but it's different now. So basically telling your own body it's safe.
Yeah,
you don't have to be in that is something that was really important for me, working on that, realizing that the feelings that I were feeling were like basically not related to the here and now. They were related to the past. So that was a really important step in my own process. Yeah,
for a lot of people it is. I have an article that readers might want to, or that listeners might want to have a look at, which is about a second childhood, like a gifted second childhood. So looking at Erik Erikson's stages of development, psychosocial development, and kind of mapping the gifted experience on them. And a lot of times, if we did go through trauma as a gifted kid, then when we're an adult, maybe we've, haven't gone through other traumas, or maybe we did and we healed them mostly. So we're like feeling mostly okay, but then there's that gifted side that's like still not totally integrated. And so then this article kind of guides people through a way of guides them to guide themselves through a sort of second childhood process, where you look at the different, developmental tasks of yourself as a gifted child, and were you able to meet them or not? And if not, what could you do to provide the safety to be able to meet them now, to be with yourself through the process now?
That would be really interesting. If you could share the link, I will put it in the show notes for people to read. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, it's been a good article for a lot of people. I think very encouraging, because it maps it out, and a lot of the fear about all of this is that it feels like, for a lot of people, it feels like a black hole. Like, if I go there, it's just going to swallow me in my life, and I can't do it. So if you have a map and you realize there's a beginning, middle, and end, and there are steps to take, then you start to go, oh yeah, okay, doesn't have to engulf everything that I am, and everything that I think, and all of my relationships and everything. This can be, a thing that I do in parallel as I'm still living my life,
Yeah.
Something I want to say, just to add to what you were saying, is that A lot of times we've recreated as adults the dilemmas of our childhood. And so sometimes it's not convincing to ourselves if we say, you're safe now, because you might actually not be safe now because you've recreated the things that you weren't, that made your life unsafe before, unconsciously usually. But like, if you people please, then you're probably going to attract people who are happy to manipulate you.
Oh, yeah.
And exploit you. I mean, I say happy to, maybe they're not conscious of being happy to, but there's something in them that finds that.
You see the patterns that things come back like in your life. And that's also part of the process, recognizing those patterns. And once you recognize that, going through how can I avoid them in the future? Because as you're saying, after recognizing those patterns, I could deal with it. But at the time, I was telling my inner child, you're safe, but I wasn't safe at all.
Right. And so the inner child's going to say, I'm going to stay exactly where I am, and I'm not going to come out until it is safe. I mean, in some way, maybe it shows up through chronic pain. Maybe it shows up through, emotional outbursts, maybe through freezing. Exactly. Like it doesn't always look the same for everybody.
You're going to show the trauma responses again if it's not
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, and it'll just keep on repeat. The frustration of, we've all of us who have had trauma know that feeling of like, no, it's happening again. I told it to stop. Why is it still doing it? It's like, well, it's still not resolved, it's still an unhealed.
Yeah. I'm sometimes joking, like it's like there's shortcuts in my brain, and I know that it's not right, but it still takes the shortcut sometimes.
Well, and also knowing is one thing, and then being able to actually live it out is a totally different thing. And you can be as profoundly gifted as you want. If your inner self is not convinced that it's safe, it's not, all the logic in the world is not going to make it, shift. So so you have to really feel that safety. And I point that out because a lot of times we get this idea that trauma work is like something we do inside with our inner child, and we like meditate and hug her, and then then we come out to the world and everything's going to be shifted. And I don't see that to be true. There's a lot of external hard work that goes into healing from trauma, like taking risks on relationships, gaining that flexibility step by step, putting up your boundaries, sometimes, kicking out abusive people from your life. Like, it's a very active process. There's a guy that his work is just fantastic. His name is Paul Linden, and he talks about, are you familiar with him?
No, I haven't read his work, just know his name. Yeah.
He does a mix of martial arts and like trauma healing, and he's a highly gifted guy that's and he has this idea of winning is healing. So that in order to really heal, we have to go through the experience that we're capable of winning whatever the thing was that we needed to win. So winning could just be having high self-esteem, even though somebody's insulting us, like not questioning our own worth because somebody is insulting us. So like healing from trauma doesn't mean, oh, well, I heal from trauma and then everything's safe and nothing bad ever happens again. Healing from trauma is redeveloping that resilience, or maybe sometimes for the first time, developing that resilience where you get to stay your authentic self, even in a world that's going to continue to offer traumatic experiences, because our world is like that. It's not, and the more things speed up, the more opportunities we get for traumatic encounters. So a lot of it is this inner work, but a lot of it is also the outer work. It's the internal coherence, but also coherence with our external world, and kind of integrating both sides. Yeah. So a lot of times we're titrating between the inside and the outside. So you get a little strength inside, and then you go try it on the outside, and you see how it works, and probably at some point it triggers you, so you got to go back on the inside. But then you keep coming back out, and you keep expanding that window of tolerance, as they call it in somatic experiencing work, and then you make those changes on the outside as you're able to. So getting abusive people out of your life, getting neglectful people out of your life, or somehow, maybe you don't have to kick them out. Maybe they will change as you change your demands. For a lot of us,
that you learn how to set your boundaries, and they learn how to respect them, basically.
Yeah, and not only boundaries in that sense, but also like stating your needs.
Yeah.
A lot of gifted people they're just not saying what they need. They're feeling totally understimulated, but they're not saying, I need more than this.
Yeah. What I'm thinking about as well, hearing you talk, is we have a mutual friend, Inga, from Social Balance, and she is a shamanic healer, and she does shamanic journeying. And one of the things that she does is doing journeying, and she's dealing with soul loss, basically. So when something happened in your life and you're basically dealing with dissociation and stuff, then basically what she does during a shamanic journey is that part of yourself, she brings it back.
Yeah.
But one of the things she always points out is your inner child is not going to be safe with you if the circumstances haven't changed. So when you haven't done that work beforehand that you're also talking about now, so you haven't learned to respect your boundaries, to indicate what it is that you need, and you cannot provide a safe environment for your inner child, then there's no way she's going to stay, because it's still not safe. The environment that has caused the trauma, it hasn't healed.
Right.
So that was just something I was thinking of when you were talking, that no matter from which perspective we look at that, and we could look at like the ancient shamans and the way that they looked at this, or we can look at it from other like trauma therapies point of view. It all comes back to the same thing, that it's not just, here you are, my inner child, let me hug you and make sure that you're safe.
Yeah.
But you should actually do the work and make sure that that's genuine, that she is.
I think there's a saying that says something like, when a flower is wilting, you don't fix the flower, you fix the environment. And I think that's really true. And healing from trauma a lot of times is about learning how to be able to fix your environment, rediscovering the power to be able to shift your environment so that you can heal. So and so that you can, it's not just like, okay, I'm healed and then everything's cool. It's like, so that you can heal and then be this co-creator with your environment, like a really active and conscious co-creator with your environment, and that you're resilient, so that when things don't go like you want, then you have tools to be able to respond and not get stuck back in those old patterns. But a lot of times, there's this focus on, I got to fix myself. I don't know. I don't really think it's that.
No. But there should be a basic layer of safety, because otherwise, how are you going to show resilience?
Right.
I mean, you can't bounce back from something that just, makes you drown.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the other things I was also thinking about is people who listen to this podcast, they know that I wrote a book about our son, and he was experiencing something that is getting more and more attention here in the Netherlands, and that is school trauma. That there are a lot of people who don't fit within the school system, either because they're gifted, or because they're autistic, or like basically all forms of like neurodiversity. The system was not created for those people. And when the system doesn't meet your needs, obviously, like we were talking about before, that can be traumatic. Also because, he was going to school and he was basically just wasn't learning anything, because everything that they were trying to teach him, he had just learn himself. He was just learning on his own. So he was also experiencing what in the adult world we would call bore out, basically. He would just be in school for hours a day, not learn anything, just having to listen and be there. What I was thinking is we have this term like school trauma now, but wouldn't school trauma just be like one way in which like gifted trauma could manifest itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's an environment that we're in. I mean, any environment that we're in is a potential place that trauma is going to manifest itself, including when we sit alone with ourselves. I mean, we can actually traumatize ourselves by insulting ourselves constantly and telling us we'll never amount to anything, or what we've done is never good enough, or, toxic perfectionism. Usually that comes from somewhere. It's not like it just arises in our head naturally, but we can make it worse. We can make it way, way worse, right? So whether you're alone with your own inner ecosystem, or you're in the school ecosystem, or you're in the family ecosystem, or the cultural, societal level ecosystem, workplaces, for example, certain kinds of workplaces. So you can have like the business world, but you can also have the NGO world, the non-governmental organizations world. You can have whatever kind of ecosystem that you can be a part of. It has the possibility to give you some kind of specific traumatic experience. And I think what's important to remember is that, just like with parenting, you don't have to be a perfect parent. You have to be a good enough parent. Also, all of our environments, all of the ecosystems we are in, they need to be good enough, healthy enough. They don't have to meet every last little need, because if they did, it would never end. At some point. I mean, so you get the one thing, and then you think you need the next, and you think you need the next, and you think you need the next. So at some point, it's also about discerning when is enough. Like, when do you not feel like you're starving anymore, and when is it the time to be grateful for what you actually do have? And that's where I think some of the discussion around educational trauma gets confusing, because sometimes it ends up being something where people say, I should get every one of my needs met, doesn't matter about everybody else. And then I'm like, well, actually, no, you're part of an ecosystem. So the other people's needs do matter. And the same thing is true in a family. Like, you can't get all of the attention and all of the resources. You have to share it. So in that sense, it's important to identify what are the most important, like, levers, like what is the essential for you, and how do you work with the system the way that it is so that it can give you that. And really discerning between what is a need and what is that would be nice, I would enjoy that, but it's not the most fundamental need. But that gets really difficult doing that analysis when a person's in an activated state, like a trauma activated state. Then it's not so easy to do that analysis. First, you got to work to get them to feel safe, and then you can start to do that analysis together with them. And I think it's very difficult for parents and teachers to do that for children, because children maybe have a difficult time expressing what they need. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they do know, but they're scared to say. Maybe they know, but they don't know how to find the words to communicate it. And maybe they just haven't had enough life experience to even know what their options are. So that becomes really difficult to have that level of dialogue with them. So I know a lot of people really struggle for their kids, and they tell me, I hope I'm doing the right thing. They're making enemies, at the school, while they're advocating for their children, and they're thinking, okay, I hope it's worth it that I'm making these adult enemies, right?
Absolutely. But also for the people in the school, because they get this whole long list usually of this is what we want to change, like a perfect situation. And it is overwhelming for teachers as well, because there's no way that with the resources they have and the time they have that they could meet that. And sometimes I've heard stories about teachers who just said, no, I cannot do this because I don't have the time and resources. And that is something that I would like to say to teachers. It already makes a lot of difference if someone feels seen. Like, even if you cannot meet their needs, like, talk to them, make them feel seen, and all of a sudden, like, that whole list, maybe like over half of it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, because in the end, I mean, that is
all we
one
want.
of the fundamental things after feeling physiologically safe. But even that, there is a physiological element of that, because being seen is literally somebody seeing that you matter, that you are matter.
Exactly.
It's a physiological experience to be seen, and it's very, very painful to feel invisible.
Exactly. So that already makes such a difference. Like, even if that's all you do.
Yeah. I've heard parents tell me that, the teacher will say, I see this exceptional ability of your child, and I'd love to be able to help. I can't. I really don't know what to do with him, that kind of thing. And they're like, they just breathe a sigh of relief. And it's easier to tell a child, hang on, we're working on it. Maybe next year we'll find a solution. Like, adversity is also part of life. It's not like every gifted person should get every single thing that they want at every single moment. Like, that's not a good recipe for a trauma-free existence either, because then that creates other issues, like not developing resilience and not knowing how to get through it, like the adversity that's going to come in life, even if you get everything you want. Right. So so it's about finding that balance, and like you said, focusing on the things that really matter, like first being seen. And then what resources are available, and can we build on that?
Exactly.
Is it okay if I add one thing?
Sure.
Okay. This is something I hear a lot from the adult world, the gifted adult world, where they're post-processing educational trauma. So they're thinking back to the educational trauma that they went through, and they're like, how do I think of this, or how do I process this now? And so I hope that the thoughts that we've just shared now are useful for even adults listening and going, oh yeah, I can identify, I did get some of those needs met some of the time. And it just helps to relax the nervous system a little bit and say, okay, it was a mixed bag. It wasn't all perfect. It wasn't all terror. It was, somewhere in between. And there were some people who cared, and a lot of people will tell me, it was most of it was awful, but I had whatever Miss Jenkins in my 4th grade who I know she recognized me, and that carried me through. And you know what? Be thankful for Miss Jenkins then, because
absolutely, that's
great.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't take away everything else, but it eases the pain of anything else.
But that makes such a difference. I've got like one of those teachers as well, and we still send each other postcards like every Christmas, because he just made such a difference for me growing up. So that is really, really important. And some things are really small, that's microtrauma, but it just builds up. And sometimes it just helps to put things in perspective and say, those things were good, because we tend to focus only on the bad. But
especially when we're in a traumatized reaction state, then we're really hyper vigilant for what went wrong. And I see that when people, when adults are like reprocessing a lot of what they went through before, if they're doing it, and oftentimes they are doing it from a heightened, nervous system dysregulation state, and so they're hyper focusing on the things that went wrong, because they're like, I got to fix this, I can't go forward if I don't fix this. And I mean, I've been there. I'm saying they, but I know exactly what it feels like. It's quite unpleasant, but it feels like life or death. So in the moment, it feels like life or death.
Absolutely.
Fix all of that, and it's all terrible. And so I mean, if you're going through that, just know that you're not alone. We all go through that. But then it's like, okay, how do I soften? The word for me that helps a lot is soften. How do I soften toward this part of myself? Is there like another part that I can, that can give it some space and help it calm down, so we can look at this more calmly.
And I love that you're saying, you're not alone. And I think that's also a really important part of healing, like whether it's like feeling alien, being gifted, or the way that you experience trauma. realizing that you're not the only one. You're not crazy. You're not alone. There's a lot more people out there who can relate to the way you're feeling, basically. You've basically, InterGifted was founded because, you wanted to have like that community where people could basically find peers so they wouldn't be alone. Yeah. So
because from a traumatic point, trauma latent point of view, a lot of times we get really fixated on how that trauma could be healed. It's if he acknowledges that he did this wrong, then I'm going to be better. But a lot of times actually that's not how the trauma heals. A lot of times the trauma heals with a totally different person who is who just says, oh my God, I went through the same thing. That was awful. And then you go, oh, I wasn't alone. Oh, now I realize it wasn't my fault. And somehow you just, it lessens the grip on this other story that he has to admit that he did this wrong. I mean, obviously, if it's something that's still affecting you and he's still doing the thing, then, he needs to stop.
Yeah.
But a lot of times it comes from a different angle. And it is one of the reasons I started InterGifted, because I was working so much with people in coaching, and they would come and they would know how things have to get fixed. Yeah. And then I'd say, well, if you just met a couple gifted peers and you felt less alone, I don't think you'd be fixated on this solution anymore. And usually it's an impossible solution, getting somebody who's never going to admit they're wrong to admit they're wrong or something like that.
Yeah. Talking about those peers and how people will benefit that, also from that also within your community at InterGifted. I think that is really important for people to just find their group of peers, because I was also talking about this in the conversation I had with Rianne. It does play, peers play an important part we were talking about those processes and the normalizing part. Like I'm not alone, I'm not weird, I'm not crazy. Knowing that, there's people out there like you, that makes a difference. And it also helps you put things into perspective, like you said. Yeah, because if other people are dealing with things and they're doing fine, and they can also help you point out like the positives, which you've over the years you fail to see. But their stories point out the positive things. It makes things more balanced.
And if we see that they, maybe responded with greater resilience in certain areas, then we have, even though some of the input or some of their environmental situation was similar, we're like, oh, wow, what made them do that like that? I never thought of that. Like I was still over here, biting my nails in the corner, having an anxiety attack, but they seemed to come at it from a different way. Like, there's this curiosity that arises that's really important in our whole process, because again, a lot of what we're getting out of with trauma healing is we're getting out of that rigidity, the fixed patterns and the fixed ideas of how it's got to be if it's going to be healed, and we get closer to our curiosity, and the emergence of possibilities that are the real possibilities, grounded in real life, because our ideas, those fixed ideas, they come from how we constructed the world when we were in a state of trauma. So they make sense in context, but then when you move context, they don't make sense anymore. And we got to get out of that rigidity and then reconnect with our gifted curiosity, and being with people that, had a similar worldview or had similar experiences or a similar setup, and then they did different things. Then you get curious. And there's one very healing thing in our community. It's the big age difference that we have. We have, everybody of all the different ages, and then of course different cultures and different language, different mother tongues. And this helps a lot as well, because a lot of the things that I growing up in America thought were just normal. When I moved to Europe, I was like, oh, wow, what a relief to realize that some of those things just aren't, they're American normal, but they're not normal, human normal. And in the group, we see that a lot, where people are like, oh, you don't in your country, you don't think about it that way. For example, you said the thing about some other cultures being like, I'm not using the word trauma, that makes me too dramatic or like too sensitive or something. Whereas in America, everybody can use the word trauma.
The same goes for therapy, right? Like here in the Netherlands, you just don't share that you're going to therapy. And in the US, it's almost like, well, I can afford therapy.
I mean, like my hair is brown and I go to therapy. Like
exactly. And we just don't share that.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. So having these different cultural perspectives and then age perspectives, seeing people who have been through extreme gifted trauma and the way that they've come out stronger and the way they use their gifts and what they've experienced to bless so many people and mentor and nurture the younger people in the group. It's not necessarily something you go through logically to say, okay, I see they did it different, how could I do it different? It's something that happens in your body, like where you just kind of start to relax, like your body just takes a deep breath and is like, where was she when I was young? My young self loves to know that this person exists at some point in time, even if she wasn't the same her now as she was then when I was younger, but still my younger self just loves to know that she exists and that there's a person who could respond to everything that she's been through and that people like us have been through in such a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you just need that mirror, that different kind of perspective to look at things, because you are in like a loop, like a trauma loop, and you just don't see the world or your own situation as it is anymore. And then that really helps to open your eyes and to also feel that you have the opportunity to grow.
Yeah, right on.
Jennifer, I would like to thank you for this I think very valuable episode. Is there something that we haven't talked about yet that you would still like to share with the listeners?
I think one little trick I would say, a little shortcut that I sometimes like to use is a lot of times trauma is isolating. I mean, that's by nature. It sort of fragments us and then it isolates parts of those certain fragments of the whole in order to protect those fragments. And then we can see ourselves as fragmented from the greater whole. So there's our fragmented parts that are separated or disconnected from the core of who we believe we are, we feel we are.
Yeah.
And then we feel like fragmented parts of a fragment that's not connected to the whole. So sometimes I just like to take the shortcut of really visualizing that I'm part of a gifted whole in the whole world. So there's like a gifted collective energy or however you want to think of it.
Yeah.
And I belong to it. You belong to it.
Yeah.
Every listener that's gifted belongs to it. And you can hate yourself sometimes. You can judge yourself sometimes. You can feel not enough. You can have all different fragments going out and about because of trauma. But all of those fragments belong to you, and you do belong to the collective. And it's not always 100% convincing in the moment that you're feeling totally isolated. But in my experience, it can shift things greatly.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you're saying this right now, because I used to feel really isolated, but then now I'm like more focused on like energy as well, and the way that we're all connected. And somehow there seems to be like this universal level of energy that we're all connected to. And same goes for all like the all gifted people. And as gifted people, like a lot of us are more talented in feeling, that type of energy. We can really feel this energy where others cannot. But connecting to that, it does make a lot of difference, because it does make you feel less lonely, and somehow like you're part of a whole.
Yeah. Like you belong here and you matter.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
your gifted self belongs here and your gifted self matters. Because when it comes to gifted trauma, it's the gifted parts that are fragmented out and that feel isolated from the self and from the whole. So
yeah, even if you feel like insignificant and like you don't matter and like you're just weird, if that energy flows through you, you do feel connected and you matter, because the energy that matters flows through you.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I do think that this is the end point of, or there is no total end point of trauma healing, but to a degree, it's, if I can just, just for the sake of the discussion, if I can just call it kind of the end point, that's what we're aiming for, this integration and reconnection to ourselves, the whole of ourselves, and then the whole beyond us. That's the end point, but in a sense, it's also this kind of starting point. So it's like when you can get into that, if you can connect with that at all, that will provide you so much context and so much strength and so much resilience in the trauma healing process. So that's why I call it a bit of a shortcut, because if you spend some time doing that, it's something you can easily do in a visualization every day, in the morning, at lunch, 10 minutes, in the evening, or whatever, whenever you sit down to give yourself some space. And then when you're doing the healing work, the more challenging personal story healing work, you can draw on that, and that becomes a resource for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for sharing this as well. Really valuable.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm happy to have this conversation with you and to continue to explore all of these different little corners and angles and hidden rooms of the gifted trauma story. Yeah.
Great. I will also put the name of your podcast in the show notes so people know where to find you. And of course, InterGifted, if people are looking for their peers and want to have like that international group of peers, then they can go to InterGifted and they can sign up there. And I think that will be really valuable for a lot of people. Thank you.
Yeah, listeners who feel it would fit are very welcome. And for all your Dutchy listeners, we have lots and lots of Dutchies. So you'll find plenty of even local friends.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. This was really lovely.
Yeah, that was lovely.
Dit was weer een aflevering van Een Intense Reis, de podcast. Fijn dat je luisterde. Heb je naar aanleiding van deze aflevering behoefte aan hulp of begeleiding? Via www.eenintensereis.nl help ik je graag verder. Op deze site vind je ook meer informatie over mijn boek Een Intense Reis.
Luister je graag naar deze podcast? Laat de maker weten dat je waardeert wat hij of zij doet en geef een digitale fooi. Dat kan zonder abonnement, snel en simpel via fooiepot.com. Fooiepot met een d.com